I would now like to introduce the panelists for our final event of the day, which is Risk, Reward, Resilience, Financing Gender-Inclusive Climate Solutions. So our panelists for the day include, first of all, starting with Dr. Chizuru Aoki, who is a lead environment specialist at the Global Environmental Facility. Then moving on to Lauren Burnhill, who is the managing director of One Planet Ventures and is also a SAIS alumnus. Then we have Dr. Anne Kuriakos, who is a senior social development specialist in climate investment funds at the World Bank. Then we have Stacey Swan, who is the CEO and founding partner at Climate Finance Advisors. And finally, our moderator for the day, Dr. Irving Mincer, who is the managing director and chief strategist at the Potomac Energy Fund and a lecturer and visiting research scholar at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Thank you, sir, and I now hand it over to the moderator.
Thank you, Shweta. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with you today, and I would say an honor to be part of this distinguished panel, of which I have little reason to claim equal membership. But what we're here to do today is to talk about how the existential challenge of climate change, the implications of these physical changes to the physical environment, percolate through national economies and human societies in ways that create new challenges, many of which can only be addressed by substantially speeding up and scaling up investment in sustainable infrastructure and in the institutions that allow us to achieve and maintain resilience for human societies in the face of shock and natural events. We've brought together for you a panel of 4 distinguished women who have extensive experience in mobilizing capital and putting it to work for both private gain and public good. We are, in the process, going to explore the truth exposed by Chairman Mao Zedong that women hold up half the sky. We can only do this if we can only get through these challenges if we do so together. So our panel today is going to focus on risk, the way that it emerges and percolates through the natural environment into our societies, reward, the value that's added by thoughtful investment and strategic foresight in managing these challenges, and resilience. How do we build institutions and infrastructure that can help to allow us to both absorb and respond to the shock and uncertainty that's going to be part of our future, and do it in a way that leaves us stronger together? So with that in mind, we're going to start with my friend Chizu Aoki, who's the lead environmental specialist and one of the intellectual engines driving the Global Environment Facility to bring large-scale capital to bear on a series of global environmental problems, including climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion, the need for biological diversity, and international rivers. So with that, Chizu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Irv. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. My perspective that I'm going to talk for the next 5 minutes, oh, by the way, I'm going to time myself because I have a tendency to talk a lot. Okay, my perspective that I wanted to share with you, as Irv introduced, is actually from one of international public financing institution. I think you might have heard already today what the GEF does. We are a fund established to basically invest in the health of the global environment. And we finance developing countries to achieve the goals of the so-called multilateral environmental agreements. I'm sure you've all heard about the Paris Agreement. I'm sure you all know about the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. The GEF, along with the Green Climate Fund, are the official financial mechanism for these climate agreements. And we also, the GEF also finances biodiversity, chemicals, so on and so forth. So we are financed entirely, I would say, by donor resources. So we are basically accountable to taxpayers' money, okay? And we provide support almost always on grant basis. In other words, we might support concessional financing, but our operational modalities, basically we provide cash grants to developing countries. And we provide cash grants in all the focal areas to 153 countries altogether. In the greater scheme of things, we are very small. We've so far supported 4,000 projects in the past 25 years. Our grant financing mobilization is about $14.5 billion altogether. And we provide what's called the incremental financing as well as additional reasoning to support climate mitigation as well as adaptation in other areas. Okay, those of us in the international public climate finance business, we're primarily concerned about, I would say, three figures that are presented in front of us in terms of climate finance challenges. The one that's actually quite well known is the 100 billion question. How are we going to mobilize $100 billion on an annual basis to address, and that's as the floor and the only ways up to address the developing country challenges in the climate finance arena. But as Irv already mentioned, there is also a $1 trillion challenge to address the clean energy infrastructure needs that countries are facing. That's $1 trillion per year just to do clean energy, energy efficiency, as well as power supply type initiatives. And then we're talking about a staggering amount of $90 trillion needed to actually put into place in mostly developing countries infrastructures. We're talking about roads, hospitals, housing, ports, so on and so forth. And how do we go about making that in the most sustainable, climate resilient, as well as low carbon way? And those are the challenges that we as a GF, as well as other climate financiers operating in developing countries are actually facing. Okay, contrast to that is the cardinal rule that we have as a public institution. And that cardinal rule of climate finance is so-called the country-drivenness. In other words, support we provide to developing countries, it actually has to address the needs and priorities that developing countries themselves have identified. And I'm sure you've all heard about the whole notion of the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and what have you. So with this question, if you look into what exactly are developing countries putting on the table as priorities for climate action, and how is gender being targeted within that context, I did a little bit of homework on this one as I was preparing this for this particular panel, and it was actually kind of sad, I have to say. And I should mention that we are mandated by the Paris Agreement as well as the Convention to support the implementation of the NDC priorities, right? So we're basically told this is what you will support. If you look at the INDCs and NDCs submitted by 161 countries, as of now, only 65 countries had any mention whatsoever of gender or women, right? And of those, about 35 countries identified adaptation, women, in terms of priority sector of actions, capacity development and programming. Less than 20 countries, 19 countries said mitigation. Okay, 2 more minutes, I'm sorry. Role of women in mitigation primarily related to energy is necessary. So in other words, we're ready to finance adaptation, mitigation, climate action in the most gender neutral as well as gender specific way. But the fact of the matter is that the countries themselves are not at this point necessarily articulating gender-relevant climate action as their priority. So how do we go about addressing this? I think we have a menu of options that we've looked into as a fund, but one of the things we've actually done is we actually have to make gender relevance as almost like a precondition to ask for resources from us. In other words, we put into, do we have a minute? Okay.
No pressure, though.
Okay, no pressure. So I guess I can talk a little bit more about this in the context of the dialogue. But, we actually basically said, any project that comes to us, you have to actually do a gender analysis. 50% of all projects actually that are considered, 50% of all projects would have to do gender analysis. 100% of new projects actually need to incorporate gender-responsive project targets. 50% of all direct beneficiaries of the GF funds actually have to be women, direct beneficiaries, and so on and so forth. And we also said on the plans, strategies that the GF will finance for the country to prioritize, at least 60% of those reports that would come to us in the next 2 years would have to reference gender. So it's not perfect, but we're trying to introduce systemic change to make sure that the funds themselves has the mechanism to address gender relevance in a more systemic way. So I will stop right there.
Great. Thank you very much. Lauren, I think you have to come to the podium
for the
to cue up your slides. So Lauren Burnhill is a seasoned emerging markets credit and investment professional that spent her life working on issues related to bottom line finance that has social benefits. She brings a focus on small and medium enterprises and on structured finance that has allowed her to bring these skills to areas of health, affordable housing, clean water and sanitation, renewable energy, and basic infrastructure and services. So without further ado, I leave you in her good hands.
Thank you. I just want to say I'm not really a climate expert and I'm not really a gender expert. I'm a finance person, but I have always been a finance person that had more than one bottom line. It's not just about the money. It's about the returns to people and planet. The planet side, really, I'd left off for a very long time. And actually, part of the reason I'm here today is that I started a public benefit corporation a year or so ago called Resilience Resources that focuses on long-term finance and governance around the intersection of climate resilience and social resilience, because I'm not saving the planet for the cockroaches. Really, I have been in it to improve the quality of life for all of us ever since I started out. And this slide I actually presented at the World Pensions Council in London a couple months ago to say all investment has social and environmental impact. Now, I realize in your economics class, you have been taught that social and environmental impacts are externalities, and you will need to tell them that on your economics orals if you want to pass the first time around. But negative externalities are risks that you're ignoring, and they could cost you money and potentially lower your returns. Positive externalities are opportunities you're ignoring to boost your returns, tangible and intangible, and make the planet a better place than it started out. Because I'm not an expert, I wanted to address the questions the panel had been posed. You can't read the slides, but I've turned them in so you can have them later. What drives this public-private finance gap? How do we get to the $100 billion a year? Well, we have at least 3 different sets of actors: the public sector, the private for-profit sector, the private not-for-profit sector. Lots of misconceptions within each group about what the other groups are, who they are, what they care about. Also something related from neuroscience called the negativity bias. Because in evolutionary times, if a saber-toothed tiger was chasing you, you needed to run, and the next time you saw that tiger, you needed to get out of the way quickly. It only takes 3 to 6 negative events for us to internalize forever that lesson. But it takes something like 30, 40 positive events to counteract it. So really, and added to that, personal and organizational interests often preempt collaboration. I'm happy to say that's changing rapidly. Everybody wants to partner and collaborate with everybody else. We're just figuring out how to do it and what that looks like. My advice on that is question the assumptions and then question the definitions, because we all need to be on the same page and working toward common goals. And even when we think we are, honestly, even when I'm working with my own staff, we're using words in different ways. So clarity around what we're saying is important. So the gender climate link and how we can break it. And I just want to say, great resource that I found too late to add to the slide, the UN Women Watch. If you go to un.org/Women Watch, they have a fact sheet on women and climate change that has links to amazing resources in every category you could think of. I probably do not need to tell this audience that women are actually the group most affected by climate change. And that is because the physical effects hit first on women and on children and seniors, but women are the ones who care for them. We are most of the agricultural workforce in most of the world, and on top of working in the fields, women are going out in the morning to get water. They're worried about food security. There's less food when there's less water. I personally, despite what I've been doing, was astonished by the link there. And so 3, not quick fixes, but meaningful asks. If you're designing a project or looking at a project, where are the women in it? Where are the gender-sensitive issues? Next big one, gender-segregated statistics. If we lump everybody together, we don't know when women are receiving more or less resources than otherwise. And the third is gender-inclusive governance. I do a lot of work in governance. I sit on a lot of boards. I am very frequently the only woman on those boards. If we don't have a say in how things are run, how do we change how they're run? Those are my 3 slides. I think I have 10 seconds left. I would just add, I went to the Bologna Center as an undergraduate, and I am a SAIS Wharton graduate. During the reception, if anyone wants to ask about any of that, I am available. Thank you all.
Our third speaker, Ann Kyriakos, is a senior social development specialist at the SIF. Now, all of you I know are quite familiar with the SIF as the Climate Investment Funds. They are a vehicle collectively for investing billions of dollars in climate-related investments. Ann has more than 20 years of experience in working on gender and social development issues, in particular on issues related to climate adaptation, rural development, water security. She's worked at the World Bank since 2005 and has worked in regional operations and anchor units, as well as on issues of governance and agricultural development. She's led analytical work on gender and understands the challenges that women face.
Thanks very much, Irving. And thanks so much to SAIS Global Women Leadership Organization for this event. I think 5 years of conferences is a remarkable achievement, and you can see what sorts of discussions this event has engendered today, and thanks for that. I'm Ann Kyriakos. I'm the Senior Social Development at the Climate Investment Funds, responsible for mainstreaming gender across our programs in climate mitigation and adaptation, which are funded around the level of $8.3 billion, working through the World Bank and all the regional development banks. So it's a big portfolio of around 300 projects working in 72 countries. And we're organized around 4 specific programs, looking at sustainable forest management, at renewable energy in both middle-income countries and energy access projects in low-income countries, as well as our pilot program for climate resilience, which is adaptation planning and support to resilient development investments. So today I'm going to speak, of course, around the links between gender and climate and some of the examples, particularly from the energy sector, as I know there's a concentration here at SAIS on that, and what that looks like in terms of project design. As we know, climate-smart development and resilience goals can't be achieved without meaningful attention to the link between gender and climate, and gender biases form that additional layer of risk that keeps women and girls from really being able to maximize the use of their human capital and asset development in countries around the world. The climate investment funds, for their part, were established to really test and deploy and learn from the implementation of climate finance at scale. So these are large-scale projects all the way up to kind of hundreds of millions in large-scale renewable energy, down to much smaller projects focused on policy reform and efforts around governance and institution building in areas like forestry, as I mentioned, water management, and others. Since 2014, we've been trying to really have a strong push on gender under our SIF Gender Action Plan, and the phase 2 of that was just approved last year. We're very happy with the achievements so far, particularly in being able to mainstream gender quite a bit more in our renewable energy portfolio, which had been lagging compared to the adaptation work. And yet we know that there's so much more that can be done. And so the second phase is really looking for gender transformative outcomes in terms of what this looks like for women's voice and agency, for economic opportunities, and also for livelihood status on the ground. And yet at the same time, we know that the model of official aid to public sector, for example, which is the predominant form of our projects, is not sufficient, and that we need to really help crowd in private sector finance through our project work and the model that we're undertaking. And so we're very proud of the fact that that $8.3 billion has been able to leverage an additional $58 billion in finance through a variety of sources, and that includes private sector investments. And so I'd like to turn now to some examples of the energy investments that really showcase how you can, right from a kind of upstream early intervention point of view, in individual, including private sector transactions, mainstream gender in a way that both meets the needs of the project and the project sponsors, but also leads to some real tangible outcomes for women and girls on the ground. One of these was our project in Colombia, which again was really to demonstrate the realism of gender integration upstream in private sector settings. There was a 28 megawatt investment around renewable energy generation using third-party solar development models. And they're thinking again around long-term institutional change and the this question of the pipeline in the renewable energy industry in terms of thank you. In terms of STEM education and employment for women in the new kind of green growth sectors in renewable energy. And this is a matter of individual firms that were investing, also signing up to things like the UN Women's Empowerment Principles and committing to kind of internship programs and placing women in the energy and the operations and the finance units of these energy firms, which really are places that they had not yet been placed in, as we heard in this morning. At a much lower scale in terms of our clean cook stoves work in Honduras, we've been working quite a bit to make sure that distribution models in these new technologies are scaled up and that there's financing attached to it so that we can help women with enterprise development. It's not just the delivery of the service, but the additional economic opportunities that can come through these sorts of investments. And similarly, in Nepal, I think one of our interesting examples from the investments in mini-grids and the importance of linking up those particular investments with the country's own national goals around social inclusion and gender integration. And there, because the country's got very tight and targeted goals around inclusion of women we were talking about intersectionality this morning, not just in terms of sex disaggregation, but looking at ethnic minority status and socioeconomic tiers. And the country is tracking outcomes for women from those different groups in these investments. And so tied to that then is design around specific projects which look at both the complementary services and the sort of productive use applications of energy in mini-grid development that help lead to climate resilient outcomes and sustainable futures for women. I think I must stop here because we have a very strict moderator, but I certainly welcome questions in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. Our fourth speaker, immediately on my right, is my partner and colleague, Stacy Swan, who teaches here at SAIS in these areas of risk and climate finance. Stacy's had extensive experience both in public finance and in private finance in international financial institutions, including the IFC and the World Bank, and has served a secondment with the U.S. Department of the Treasury in mobilizing national policies to support sane, sound, sustainable investment in infrastructure to support a climate-smart future. Stacy?
Thank you. Or is this on? Yeah, great. So first, let me just say thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this panel. This is hopefully going to be a really rich and great discussion. So I'm Stacy Swan. I'm CEO of Climate Finance Advisors. We are a consulting firm here in Washington, D.C. Our core strength and skills that we bring to our clients really is around the topic of blended finance. And all of our team has experience using public dollars to leverage private dollars, mostly in the climate space, and with SIF funds and with JEF funds and with other sources of public capital to catalyze private investment in emerging markets that are climate smart, mostly in energy. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But my background, I spent about 13 years at IFC, 10 of which I ran the blended finance unit, and 3 of which I was in positions in the World Bank and in the US Department of Treasury. Before going to IFC, I was a project developer. I lived in India. I was on the other side of the table, as it were. I was building things and going out and getting money for the things that we were building. So I feel like I've worn a number of different hats in this space. I've been a developer building projects. I've been a financier inside IFC investing in projects. I've run a fund. I spent some time in the US Department of Treasury working on the policy aspects of climate finance and how to catalyze, take public money to catalyze private investment. And most of it in the climate change space. But I will say, if it's been 20 years that I've been doing that, it's been 19 and a half years that the conversation has been around energy. And the Venn diagram for doing this in energy, which is good for you and those of you who are in the E&E program, really is filled with a lot of men. So when you put energy and finance together, you really have a lot of men. And it's been funny to kind of work through this. Blended finance is an area where you see a few more women, and particularly women who have a financial background who care about accelerating things that aren't otherwise happening by the markets or mainstream financial institutions. So you get a few more women in that space. But I'll tell you, this week, it's been busy with the World Bank IMF meetings. I've been in a number of meetings in the last 2.5 days. If it's an energy topic or it's a finance topic, it's almost all men with a very few number of women. But if you get into resilience and risk, it's almost flipped on its head. And that's an exaggeration. But what's interesting to me is that there are a lot of women, young women, mid-career women, who are looking at the issue of climate risk and resilience. How do you actually finance the things that you need to save the world, that are working on that side of the balance sheet or that side of the agenda, which kind of struck me this week because it's important, right? You go into meetings where you're talking about catalyzing investment and it's all men and they're all talking about energy and deals, and you go into meetings where you're talking about really how do you unlock financing for what is a really difficult thing to address. It's not one metric, it's not GHG, and it's not energy production or consumption. It is physical aspects of climate risk that manifest themselves differently at different times, at different places. Two companies with the same business in a different location will have different climate risks that affect them. Just an interesting data point that I'm observing. I have nothing to back that up other than my eyes and what I'm seeing in the conferences this week, and certainly in the discussions that we have on climate risk and resilience. So just to go back a little bit, on the blended finance side of things, we are a consulting firm. Our mission is to accelerate sustainable climate smart investment. We do that by integrating climate considerations into the projects that we work on with our clients who are looking for financing, into the services or strategies that they're looking to promote, whether it's governments or countries or donors or projects. And we do some policy work and some thought leadership work around the climate risk and resilience space. I think the next frontier in blended finance is really in how to use this tool that we've gotten really good at using in the energy space and apply it to sustainable, resilient infrastructure as a low-hanging fruit, because infrastructure is really easy to understand from a financing perspective. And there's a lot of infrastructure needs in emerging markets, and also in this country. This country's infrastructure is graded as a D+. So if we're going to build a lot of things in this country, let's hope it can withstand the 2-degree world or more. And that's also going to impact a lot of women. Right? So if we're going to look at how to do sustainable infrastructure in emerging markets, you really are also going to capture the impact that that has on women. And in particular, water issues and food issues that women are deeply, everyone is deeply concerned about it, but impact women somewhat more directly. Before we get into the Q&A, I'll make a few plugs because it was raised during our conversation. there are organizations in the space in energy and environment that if you're a woman, young woman, mid-career woman, you should be involved in. One is the Women's Council on Energy and Environment. They're here in Washington. There are other organizations like them, both in Washington and elsewhere. But these are really important networking nodes for you as you start your career and you get into this space. The other thing I would say is don't be afraid to take on leadership roles, because the women on boards issue is really, really important. I've spent a couple of years also in my kind of nights and weekends with some folks who look at this issue, and the numbers in energy are really dismal. Most companies, certainly publicly traded companies, publicly listed companies, don't have enough diversity on their boards, and the gender diversity is really lacking. There's a company called Women on Boards 2020, it's an NGO actually, who does a ranking of board representation, and we have asked them for the last 2 years to do an energy sector dive into their matrix, the stuff that they collect, and they won't publish the numbers because they're so bad. So you guys are actually, and if you're interested in this space, you're the future of what should be the diversity on these companies. And that, I think, is going to make a huge difference, right? Whether you're in the oil and gas industry or you're in renewables, having diversity on boards and bringing women to the table is likely to bring the resilience angle into things in a way that is not being discussed right now. And so I think that's really important. So take opportunities for leadership, volunteer for boards, if even nonprofit boards get you kind of on that path. And then the last thing I would say is support each other. Women in these organizations tend to feel like they're all alone, but you're not. And I think it's really important to have your networks and support each other and cross-pollinate and keep up the connections that you have from here into your work life. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask us to start off by drilling down a little deeper into a couple of the points that Stacy just made in closing. And what I want to do is to ask each of the panelists, from the perspective of your own experience, to talk about what is it that allowed you to successfully make entry, gain traction, and establish a career in finance related to these issues. Chizu made reference to the fact that there's going to be $100 billion a year of new investment floating through the halls of the climate negotiations starting in 2020. That sounds like a lot of money. But as Stacy pointed out, most of the actors in that drama will be boys in suits, and mainly middle-aged and slightly doddering boys in suits. It's clear that we're going to need new blood, we're going to need new thinking, and we're depending on you to be it. So I'm going to ask the 4 successful women on this panel to talk a little bit about what allowed them to gain a bit of traction, a bit of leverage, and a willingness to withstand the daily affront of being a little bit lonely in this environment in the early years. Chizu?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because actually I don't feel very lonely in the places I'm in, to be honest with you. Because probably my in the sphere that I operate in, be it climate finance or environmental finance, there are, I would say, quite a number of successful women who are on the side of the multilateral environmental conventions, or be on the side of CEOs of environmental funds. So from that perspective, I do think that there are already a number of leaders that you can learn lessons from, as well as sort of follow the path if that's what you want to do. I don't necessarily think I have had the most successful or straightforward career in finance, considering that I'm actually an engineer. But the reason why I ended up getting into this, and I am continuing to do what I do, is because when it comes to assessing projects, understanding what it is that the proposals are trying to achieve, particularly in the works of the GEF, you can't do it without having a very deep technical expertise. And in my case, it's literally about knowing the whole notion of the technological change and what kinds of technologies can impact and which ones of those could be actually seen as robust across different policy environments. A lot of other women in my organization have studied things like biology, conservation, ecology, so on and so forth. So from that perspective, what they bring to the table is that technical expertise. And so that's something that in a workplace like the GF, we value extremely. And obviously, in more traditional areas such as finance, and I would even say energy, yeah, it's true, there are a lot of men who spent their life working on energy efficiency as well as what have you. But it doesn't mean that they can't give opportunities as well as good guidance for the next generation or women and men. So, I would say that there are opportunities out there.
Lauren, you've been involved in these activities for several decades. The situation that we face now is significantly different from the situation that was present in 1992 when the GEF was first agreed as the financial mechanism of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Can you say a little bit about how you've seen the work environment with regard to women in leadership in this area shift over the time that you've been engaged in these activities?
So I think one of the things that is very interesting, and it answers an earlier question of how do you get more women into finance, most of the women I know in finance who enjoy what they're doing are doing something where there is a social, environmental, or some kind of additional benefit. They're not doing it in general just for the money. I think as mainstream society has become more aware that doing stuff about the climate, that social, if we don't even want to say social justice, social equilibrium is an issue as inequality is growing. The notion that finance can be something beyond pure monetary profit, I think that's actually encouraging a lot of women to move into things like impact investment and social finance. And frankly, money's fungible, finance is finance. Doesn't really matter how you get into the field as long as you're moving into it. So I think that changing societal notions, changing values, changing priorities are creating new pathways that we want to follow. Although I will also say, when I began my career, I thought the lack of women in finance was a fringe benefit. So perspective, also important.
And before coming to the World Bank, you worked at a number of leading NGOs who have quite a different corporate culture than you find in the Bretton Woods institutions. Can you say a little bit, as many of the women in this room who are soon to graduate or recently graduated from SAIS are thinking about opportunities in both the NGO sector as well as in private sector financial institutions or in the multilateral development institutions. Can you say anything about how you've seen the situation for women in NGOs in this area evolve over that period of time, and what advice you could give to women who are looking out into making that first entry into the job market or returning to work in the job market in this particular space?
Thank you. I have to say, when I first showed up at the World Bank in 2005, I was kind of floored that there weren't more people who had that sort of NGO kind of field experience background, because I think it's very important to really understand from the perspective of what development means to people around the world in countries. And so I deliberately chose to work, in this case, for my first job after university with a Indian NGO, because I wanted that national perspective on and country perspective on what was important in terms of development outcomes, and learned a lot through that, and went and worked with other NGOs in Pakistan and elsewhere. I think, to echo some of the themes that have come up already, the importance of a sector specialism is quite important. Having that kind of deep technical thread in one area helps you then kind of apply and see the cross-linkages with other areas. So I started in rural development. My master's was in gender and development, which was one of the first programs at the Institute of Development Studies focused on gender, and so a lot of the gender leaders around the world now from the early 90s, those early classes that kind of seeded this work. And so I see gender as it is a technical area, and it doesn't have to do with whether a man or a woman is doing it. We have a lot of very competent, very experienced male gender specialists in the World Bank, and so I think it's important to be able to to distinguish exactly what you're contributing in terms of technical knowledge. So again, in my case, started in rural development, from there through water with linkages to land, and it was that water, land, and NRM piece tied to all the gender experience I had in training.
What's NRM?
Sorry, natural resource management, which then kind of put me in a very good position when fortuitously the climate investment funds decided to open this staff position around gender and climate, which is very unusual among these institutions. And very pleased now that the World Bank particularly has gone even further and is now setting up a gender and climate program that I'm leading across the institution, which works across all the sectors that we're involved with. And that's a program that's going to go through 2023 and just, again, shows the commitment of the institution to making sure that we're deepening our efforts in a very kind of technically consistent way that's looking at specific outcomes. So I do take, sometimes even with International Women's Day or things like this, I see all sorts of what I consider quite fluffy stories and events where it might just happen to be a woman who was the entrepreneur who got the X million finance, for her firm. That's wonderful. That's leadership in a particular sense, but it's not necessarily that a funding institution has taken that gender lens and applied it. It's just that the biological sex of that particular entrepreneur. And I think it's important to make those distinctions when we're talking about work in gender and climate, because it goes much beyond just kind of counting who's benefiting, as we heard this morning, to doing the analysis that helps us design for better outcomes.
Thank you. Stacy, your career has followed an arc of development that spans the range from a fairly aggressive project finance-oriented development corporation through the work of the IFC and blended finance to a government organization. How have you seen the opportunities and roles for women in this particular space evolve across that range? And what can you say to women who are preparing to leave these hallowed halls and do battle in the financial sector?
So let me start. I'm gonna answer that after I answer the question you asked over here, because three of us have worked inside the World Bank Group, and you had a keynote speaker this morning, Rachel Kite, and I started at the World Bank in January 2003. And I believe she became the vice president or the director of the unit that I was working in around 2004, but I saw and I witnessed her almost single-handedly promote this issue from within in an institution that was ripe for it, because the multicultural institution of the World Bank Group, does give everyone, let's say, a kind of leg up in terms of awareness to begin with, right? And she made great strides, pushing this agenda, and maybe you can say this is causal, I don't know, but the donors also really started becoming aware of gender issues and promoting gender issues through their programming and even into climate finance by the end of, let's say, 2010, roughly, when we had some major donors, major European countries, essentially mandate that climate finance had to start looking at this issue. And I'm not sure that would have happened without Rachel's leadership. She was really instrumental in promoting that in the institution. I will say, having said that, though, it was a ripe corporate culture. And when I left the bank and took a secondment through the U.S. Department of Treasury, I will just say that I think I was a little shocked at the fact that the awareness wasn't as high as it was inside a multilateral institution. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the U.S. Treasury. I mean that mostly that the rest of the world really wasn't looking at this issue. Most people don't think hadn't thought of diversity issues in the same way. It was really in the context of NGOs and in international development, but in the normal walking down the street people or in policy halls in most governments, it really wasn't something that people paid much attention to. That changed a little bit. I don't know where it is now. You could take the election as a data point that maybe we haven't gotten nearly as far as we should have on this issue, so there's a lot of work to do. But in terms of answering your question about the evolution of opportunities and rules for women in this space, I would agree with what some of the other panelists have said. And in particular, in mainstream finance, in the banks and in investment banks, or in the meeting I just left, which was mostly men, talking about green banks, there's something about chasing the deal and getting the deal done, and maybe it's also about the bonus you get at the end of the deal, which incentivizes a lot of people who are in finance. But it seems to be that that women, and this is a gross generalization, because I do think there are a lot of women who also like the chase of the deal, but it seems to be that women really value the impact side of things. And my perspective is that value of the impact side increases with age. I think if you come right out of business school and your master's degree in your 20s, getting into an investment bank and chasing the deal is what everybody does, and you do that, and you put your value system around that and your incentive structure around that. But at some point, that's not enough, usually. So it has evolved in that sense. The good thing is, I think, in both climate change, whether you're looking at development and blended finance and things that are like more akin to impact investing, or if you're looking at kind of the markets, there's a lot of opportunities for women in investment that can also fulfill that impact side of their goals, objectives.
Okay. Well, we have a really talented panel, but we have a room full of richly engaged, smart women. So I want to take a break here to change the course. And there are a couple of men, it's true. And we'd like to take some questions from people in the audience. There are a couple of microphones. I have a small number of basic rules that I'm going to insist on, which is when you take the microphone, tell us who you are and what institution you're affiliated with, and try to be brief so that we can get as many people a chance to talk as possible. So who would like to start? Over here?
Thanks, Aaron. Hello, my name is Chloe Colbert. I'm a second-year master's candidate here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, studying conflict management. I came to this panel and I came to this great conference today to learn more about climate change and energy and resources that I don't always have the advantage to take a lot of classes, but studying conflict and that there are migrants related to climate change and conflict. How does your field of work interact with a national security, discussion, as well as the opportunity to talk about migrants and IDPs and conflict and an energy level? Thanks.
Let's take 3 questions, and then we'll give the panel a chance. We have one up here and one back here. This woman in the white.
Thanks. My name is Pamela. I'm a recent graduate from Washington University in San Luis. I'm originally from Indonesia. I'm an engineer, but I'm gonna ask you about economic development in developing countries. So most developed countries, have developed their economy in the past when there are far less environmental restrictions and also far less environmental awareness. But now the developing countries are advised by developed countries to develop their economy with a lot of environmental restrictions, which is some say is unfair. So, what would you say about this? About the position developed countries should take when approaching developing countries on this issue? And second is, do you have any other ideas about development path that developing countries should follow in order to develop their economy while at the same time reducing their greenhouse gas emissions? Thanks.
Okay, and we had a woman in pink in the back.
Hi, my name is Julie Collins, and I graduated from SAIS in 2014, and I have a background in international development and water. And I had a question mostly for Stacy. You mentioned that the majority of finance opportunities around climate change are focused on energy, but especially in the blended finance space, I was wondering what opportunities you see for opportunities that might not have as much economic returns, such as water.
Okay, so we're going to let each of the panelists choose one or two of those. I'm going to start with Stacy this time and move to my right to Chizu.
So I'm going to answer these two questions kind of simultaneously. So blended finance was born out of this recognition that the challenge of climate change is more expensive than public dollars can actually solve, right? And so we have $1 trillion a year in sustainable low carbon resilient infrastructure. We have $100 billion a year, the kind of Paris climate pledge. If you put together just simple math, all the public budgets that would be allocated to these things in the world, they don't add up. So everyone recognized a long time ago that you needed to have some way to get private capital in. You needed your public money to be deployed as efficiently as possible in order to do that. But I think the conversation has overshadowed what is a really important series of discussions around the fact that the public sector, the public side of the budget still has to support, finance, and prop up public goods, which includes safety nets, which includes ways to deal with conflict and migration, which may be water in some places. I mean, the culture of paying for water versus paying for electricity is not always there, and this is a public good, and yet it will become very, very expensive. So we've almost lost the narrative a little bit in the blended finance space around what is the role of the public funding, X the efficient use of public capital to leverage private investment in places that private investment can be leveraged and where there is potential for good returns and where markets can be created. There's still a whole set of things that we need to do to address climate change that are squarely in the lap of the public good, right? And how do you finance that? Because that's a really important question if your public budgets are limited. And if you don't address these things, or if you take all of your public money and say, well, the private sector is going to solve this, we're just going to give them some patient capital or some money to blend, and then the private sector is going to do it all, it's not equitable. You have huge income inequality issues that it continues to promote because it tends to flow towards the wrong parts of the economy if the policy people are not mindful. So you set yourself up for kind of an increasing gap, right? And they're just basic functions that government should be doing. The migration and conflict issue, well, let me talk about migration, but in a lot of parts of the world, this is a direct function of fewer resources and fewer opportunities because those resources aren't there, like water. So I think that's a really important thing that we can't lose sight of in this space. And there's financing. There's ways to address this from a financing perspective, but you need to have the perspective of the fiscal responsibility and the role of the fiscal budget in solving some of this stuff.
Anne?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll piggyback on some of that, particularly with regard to the climate-induced migration question. And we're actually doing quite a large global study on this now at the World Bank. Because it's such a pressing issue. And we've seen that nexus of conflict fragility, climate-stressed environments that expose populations due to water scarcity, and also kind of tenure conflicts that come from this. And then just the actual displacement of people, how cities absorb these in-migrants, and how you plan in terms of resilient infrastructure for these different populations. We have an approach that's been running for several years now and slowly scaling up at the bank called adaptive social protection, which works at a number of different levels. The kind of simplest form in a sense, although it took some time to develop that model, is trying to put kind of buffers in place, contingent financing, where when shocks hit the economy in terms of extreme events, et cetera, and you need to rapidly scale up your social protection outlays to populations, there's this risk financing there in place that helps cover that for the country. And we've done that in the Caribbean, now in the Sahel and other regions. But more than that, I think at a local level in terms of investments in adaptation in exposed areas, we see work where through the Cash for Work programs, you can have small-scale infrastructure investments in soil and water management. And if you design those wage labor rates for the projects in such a way that you're attracting more women than men to actually kind of do the work, get those transfers, which helps buffer the shocks. But you're also building up the area resilience because you're investing in the soil and water management and small-scale irrigation. So that's a way of kind of helping both households and communities, and in this case, particularly women, with the future of those regions. And yet, at the same time, our migration study is showing that, over time, countries need to be planning for what this looks like subnationally, because already, again, in parts of the Sahel, you're seeing areas that are just not, may not be viable in the long term. And how do countries plan for that?
I just want to add one last thing. It is in country self-interest to think about this stuff this way, right? And often that message isn't carried across. The public policy and finance folks don't actually see it as a self-interested issue. They see it as a budget allocation issue. But your point about national security is actually exactly what that is all about. Right?
Lauren?
So I'm going to answer two questions. The first one is yours, and it's a really quick answer. The development path, not involving natural resources, involves the biggest resource that every country on the planet has, its people. The way to ensure a viable development path is to invest in health, education, and housing, and to a particularly inclusive health, education, and housing, so that women as well are involved. Because if we are educated and empowered, we go out and change the world. And by we, I don't just mean women. I mean people everywhere, and particularly, I would say, the new generations coming up because of the proliferation of mobile phones, media formats, knowledge transfers immediately, the ability to learn and then use that learning to achieve different goals and new goals. Clearly regulatory frameworks are an issue, but investing in people is the path to development. The other question I wanted to answer was, how do we finance things that don't have cash flows, essentially? And I want to start by saying that my definition of blended finance is different than Stacy's, because the dichotomy isn't just public-private, there's different kinds of private money. So it's finding the right money for the purpose you're looking for, but beyond that, I would say, we're calling this now enhanced metrics, but really looking beyond the financial metrics. Sometimes it's qualitative to quantitative coding of information. Sometimes it's actually borrowing metrics that exist in other areas. For example, real estate metrics around walkability scores, how that impacts property values. Why can't we use that to look at how adding green features to a community changes property values in that community? I think we can. That's the kind of thing that I'm working on with Resilience Resources. And the second piece of that, whether it's blended finance or not, the argument I was having with a colleague this week was, do we need a resilient investment metric? Her argument, or mine, no, she said, we need an investment grade resilient metric because we have to be investment grade to move money. And I said, no, we need investment grade instruments, which means metrics that we start looking at now and over the next years as we're doing these different things, collect data. But in addition to collecting data now, just really looking for ways that we can report on what it is we're doing. Because as I said, they're not externalities, they're environmental and social are related.
Chizu.
Yeah, I'm going to try to answer the question on conflict, environment, and climate angle, and maybe a little bit on the development pathway question. I spent, before I came to the JEF, I spent, I would say, about 6 years doing post-conflict environmental assistance for Iraq. And most of that period, I would say, wasn't even post-conflict. It was probably active conflict in the sense we couldn't even enter the country. So, but what we had noticed is that there were a lot of interests among the local communities to go back to where they actually came from, if there were assurances of safety and basic drinking water and certain infrastructure that would enable them to go back to their countries in a safe and sound manner. So, and they didn't want more studies and analysis and what have you. They just wanted a little bit of support from the international community that they can actually go back. And what we ended up doing was work across different ministries to see if we can release water into the Tigris and Euphrates River basin. So you would actually start to introduce additional water into the southern marshlands of Iraq, which was drained by the Saddam regime. And also the fact that they were undergoing significant drought conditions in the region actually didn't help. But, one of the things we did is basically compromise and have some water released. And even though the water quality is not good, we put in certain measures to make sure that we can at least provide the basic drinking water supply of 30 liters in a modular fashion and try to use, they do actually have a lot of sunlight, to be honest with you. So see if we can actually hook that up with some of the photovoltaic options and actually run diesel at the same time, because there is no way you can actually provide some of the services in the most environmentally sustainable way under most extreme conditions of conflict. But we actually have to go ahead and try to provide the short-term services and to link that into the redevelopment of the country, where the country itself will take more ownership to provide basic sanitation, drinking water, education, provision of housing, and so on and so forth. So I would say that there are possibilities and there are support mechanisms, as well as some good, I would say, emerging bright case studies that show that through consistent collaboration, as well as some ingenious thinking, and sort of putting also the responsibility in the hands of the recipient country as well as communities, there can be longer-term options to address the whole notion of restoring communities and addressing the environmental disasters in a post-conflict setting. So, if you're interested, I can give you a lot more information on that one. And to your question, sorry, just one second. I'm not going to talk about development pathways, but what you raise is that there's a sense of unfairness in the developing country context. In the climate arena, particularly in the negotiations, there's a concept called common but differentiated responsibilities. And that basically captures that we all have the common responsibility to address the climate change, right? But there are differentiation among the parties, in this case, developing countries versus developed countries, in terms of the readiness as well as resources to get to that. And that's part of the reason there are funds like the GEF, the Green Climate Fund, where donors are putting the money into the pot to help the developing countries address that additional cost that the countries would need to do their development pathways in a more sustainable way. So that's one of the ways to address that issue that you raised. So,
okay.
2 words that I forgot to my...
2 words.
Literally, credit enhancements.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll give each of the panelists 1 more minute. I guess I'm going to take 3 more questions. So I'll take 1 here, 1 there, and 1 here. Briefly.
Hi, my name is Wendy Chan. I'm from Accenture, and I, as a global firm operating in 120 countries, we are certainly very interested in sustainability issues. So can you talk a little bit about what is the private sector's role in what you're doing here, and how can private sector sort of encourage gender-inclusive climate change solutions?
Okay. 1 here, and then 1 there. The third one is right here, but the second one is here.
Hi, my name is Shweta, and I'm a student here at SAIS. I guess my question goes on to a broader area of gender-inclusive financing in general itself. So on a broader level, I was just wondering that sometimes gender-based financial discrimination is not very direct, in the sense that it happens in very indirect means. Like, for instance, I can give you an example of, let's say, female entrepreneurs who often venture into less capital-intensive industries because there's less debt involved and there's lesser risk, which also means there's lesser finance in that. So when you talk about gender-inclusive financing, how does that sort of impact these indirect effects? And I think a broader question is, what does it mean for financing to be gender-inclusive? Does it just mean more money going out to these development projects and making sure that there's more money in the hands of women? Or does it also take it a step ahead to make sure that the money is being used for their empowerment? And sort of basically, where does the boundary of that financing start and end? Yeah.
And the last question is here.
My name's Linnea. I'm a former Fulbright scholar, and I work for a nonprofit here in town. And I actually work specifically with private sector leaders, individual business leaders, and we mobilize them for advocacy around public policy. So I've been at a number of the World Bank spring meetings this week, but that's where it really hit me that climate finance and finance in terms of social and climate resilience is such an exciting place for the private sector, aside from advocacy. So my background so far is in nonprofit and think tank work. So for someone like me who would maybe trying to be transition, what is the best career advice that you would give for getting a foot in the door for this type of sector?
Not even one of these questions is a 1-minute question.
Oh my goodness.
But Chizu, let's start with you. Pick anyone, say something pithy and powerful.
Okay, pithy and powerful. And maybe I'm coming this from an entirely different angle. Maybe this is not applicable to U.S. citizens, but if you're actually coming from a different nationality, a lot of times your government actually has mid-career or even entry-level programs to place you in places such as a World Bank or any of the international organizations. I did that. So I don't think the United States has that program, but a lot of other OECD governments and developing countries have them. So
marry somebody and get a foreign passport, you're good.
Well, if you want to take that route, you have to give up your U.S. nationality. So,
that's true.
Which I will stop right there.
Lauren.
Okay, how can I do this all in 1 minute? Private sector role in climate change and gender. We have only one planet. There's, as Eleanor said, there's no planet B, so the private sector is full-on responsible for everything that they do, climate and gender related. What does gender inclusive mean? It means that we are designing the right interventions for the right segments of society. So there was a study done by the World Bank in, I think, the 1980s of 20 years of microfinance projects, and they looked at why they weren't getting the results they wanted in certain sectors, and it turns out they were targeting men, and the men weren't the ones doing that work. When they started designing certain interventions to reach the women who were doing what they wanted to do, lo and behold, they worked. So gender inclusive really means creating opportunities everywhere, but also when you are targeting actions to do it appropriately. And then the last one, how to transition. What do you want to do? What skills can you get? How quickly, effectively, or inexpensively, depending on your budget. And then just go for it. I literally, in my coming out of graduate school days, I would write to people very high up in an organization that I wanted to be in and just say, oh my gosh, I love what you're doing, or I heard your speech and it makes total sense. How do I get involved? Most of my jobs actually came from taking bold action around something that really excited me. So following your bliss, as my dad told me, apparently works.
Yeah, I would second that. On the question of what are the boundaries of climate finance and gender-inclusive finance, I would make a distinction here between when we're talking about financial inclusion, financial services, credit, insurance, et cetera, and what that looks like in terms of just targeting to, say, women in particular, versus this climate finance space that we're talking about overall, which is really financing the sorts of low-carbon development pathways that we've been talking about, both on the resilience side, but also the mitigation work. And so what does gender-inclusive climate finance in that larger definition look like? It is putting things like women's empowerment front and center, putting it how close is it to the overall objective of those investments? Now, obviously, we're always kind of putting sector goals first. I mean, these projects are set up for some particular reasons, but there are ways to design things to get towards better outcomes, both in terms of the specifics of implementation, but also just the logic of what sorts of components you're investing in. So, for example, good design and tweaking in Vietnam, in the case of bus rapid transit project, was making sure that transport users, both women and men, were kind of consulted, and that the additional kind of light rail investments were designing in terms of carriages and services and pricing and schedules for all the users, right? So that's a form of tweaking. Something more fundamental in the case of, say, our forest investments in Mexico was actually working with the forest agency to make sure that they're designing in terms of strategy and operations and budgeting around these goals, which was their own kind of priority as well. But then also making sure that the pipeline of training up foresters and their skills in dealing with both women and men farmers, thinking about outreach in terms of women's participation in non-timber forest product enterprises and those value chains, working at all scales, right? So that the interventions you're making at a local level are reinforced by agency changes, by policy changes in terms of land tenure reform and these things. So it's that intersection of all these components that helps lead to more sustainable outcomes, and that goes way beyond just targeting women in particular for some action.
Like that. Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I think all these points were very good. I will say the inclusion question also is as much, or let's say the transformation to a kind of a more diverse representation in some of the stuff, and therefore more kind of gender inclusive, is as much about the behavioral change as it is about finance or programs or things like that. And you know, I mean, there's a lot of studies that say that women in senior management, companies that have women in senior management positions and on the board are more sustainable and have better returns, implying that maybe there's something about the decision making of having a diverse set of people around the table, because of course it's not usually all women, in fact rarely, but then maybe other companies that aren't as diverse, and there's something to be gleaned from that, I think. So I think it's about as much about kind of being mindful that the diversity helps create greater sustainability and impact as it is about anything else. And how do you do that, in what circumstances, and how do you kind of promote more gender inclusion is important to be aware of and to act on and to try and integrate in the way that you do things.
Well, thank you. The bad news is that we could carry on this discussion for another hour, but the responsibility that's been given to me is to cruelly cut it off now so that we can move on to the closing plenary. I just ask you to do one thing. Well, I'm going to ask you to do two things. I'm going to ask you to say thank you to these four smart women, then to go out, empower your own voice, and conquer the world.